Hi everyone, thank you for coming today. My name is Lucy Cox. I'm a curator artist. I'm a member of Contemporary British Painting, and I'm also on the advisory board of the Pride and Seabrook Art Collections, which is home to many Chinese and British artists. And I also host and produce a podcast called Painters Today. And I think what we should do, for part one, is talk about your Soldier series, because I think that did play a large part in the development of this show, Companion Pieces. So if you could just give a quick overview of that series, and also your To&Fro series, which was before Soldier.
Yes, so if we talk chronologically, To&Fro was a small little solo show I had in 2017 in the small gallery associated with the school. And since about 2005, I met my now wife in Hong Kong, and as part of my journeys to and fro to that city and then back to the UK, I started to get very interested in the history of not just Hong Kong, but Britain's relationship to it. And that gave me a premise for pushing my figuration into a particular theme. I wanted to take in a particular direction. I was seeing a lot of art that I'd maybe seen in books before, but I was encountering Tang dynasty figures and things and so on. And I wanted to try and introduce into my art this idea of East and West, which is quite a happy thing a lot of people have done, and cultural appropriation is a bit of a tricky topic. But I wanted to try and find a valid way of doing that, because it was going on personally in my own life as well. It wasn't just a creative thing, stuff was happening, so it's my position to it, it's my position in Hong Kong today, as a British person, but also the baggage from the 19th century, the Opium Wars.
Right, yeah.
And I started to look at the merchant class and the traders that went on there, and what evolved out of that was this mysterious amalgam of elements of the figure from various Chinese art styles and my own inventive interpretations of the figure that I thought I'd be working with. And very briefly, I should say that I do tend to work in these sort of set myself a set of parameters and then produce a show around a particular idea. Prior to this To&Fro show, my particular figuration emerged out of a series I tended to call the Blue Boys, which wasn't an exhibition, it was actually a prompt for me to make a body of work that kind of scooped up all the preoccupations of maybe a couple of years before that, so we're talking around 2010, 2011 onwards. The Blue Boy series kind of advanced that. So To&Fro was all about that kind of thing. So already leaping forward to this show, the seeds of the ideas of duality and opposites and this dialectic was there. Soldier came about as an opportunity to show at Sandon Memorial Chapel in the anniversary year of 100 years since the end of World War I, and the close proximity to Stanley Spencer's cycle chapel, the chapel, gave me the opportunity. I could have just staged a show around my particular work. There wasn't any particular brief the chapel gave me, but I thought there's an opportunity here to try and respond to some of the latent themes in my ongoing practice around masculinity and the male and ideas of power and duty and rites of passage that allowed me to, in a very small space, put together a show that kind of broke new ground for me, but also scooped up and further took on some ideas that I found in To&Fro. Therein lay the kind of territory that I've hopefully in this show kind of scooped all those previous iterations into one more coherent exhibition.
Okay.
Hope that's not too long.
No, definitely not. I know that in the podcast you did discuss your early processes for Soldier and how you start your idea. So you spoke about cultural appropriation, that you were appropriating certain things. And I know that you that for your radar artworks that you had in that exhibition, there was that painting by Barnabas that you inspired. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, these surrender at radar, painted by Velázquez, which is a very clever bit of propaganda really for the Spanish, who were victorious at Breda, given the Dutch quite a good whipping, and the Genoese general is receiving the keys, who led the Spanish troops, is receiving the keys from, I can't remember his name, but the Dutch guys handing them over. There's Turkey, very generous, so it's magnanimity, there's that word.
Yeah.
It really shows the Spanish good life, but what a great composition it is. There's so much going on in that is obviously the horses. Adrian pointed this out. There are two horses, and if you actually look at them, they're moving almost. It's the same horse that's moving in the circle. Yes, if you can find that image from everything here. It'll be this way, I think. Yeah. So these two horses, so there's one turning in like that, and then there's one there coming out. And David was saying, yeah, I reckon this is the same horse. And I hadn't thought about that, because what had interested me about the composition was this division down the centre of the canvas between the victors and the vanquished. And all the spears, it's quite often colloquially known as the spears, they're all very vertical, and you know, there's a potency there. Then all over here there's disarray, there's a smoking of brain in the background there, and everybody looks vanquished. A little bit defiant in some of the faces there. But that painting, there's no way I believe we've come close to what it's a massive painting, so it's nice. But it nevertheless inspired me, this central figure group there, the exchange between the two figures gave me the opportunity to explore that sort of thing about conflict, about war.
Yeah. So you took that as a kind of a motif and then ran with it really. So you've got these images here. So for example, this image of the old soldiers, which does resemble, the two figures meeting.
Yes.
But they're doing all sorts of things, aren't they? I mean, are they exchanging or are they fighting?
Yes. Well, the introduction of the red object, there's no one keys and something else. This is I don't mind using the word failed quite often when I'm talking about my work. This is a failed lino cut, but nevertheless, the way that I was printing on Chinese paper, and the way that I lifted it off, it suggested, it was quite surprising, unlike the other impressions I got from this lino, they didn't look old. These guys looked old in this one, so that's how that evolved, and a little bit of body colour and so on. It was painted afterwards. Gave that particular impression of very unique flavour.
Yeah. And I just ask you about your soldier book series as well. Where did this particular motif come from?
I've got photographs of myself dressed up, and I've got photographs of other boys in uniform dressed up as soldiers.
Yeah.
Of course, I built quite a library of images up, and some of these kids in uniform aren't playing, they are actually short boy soldiers from different decades and centuries. That idea of the child and the fact that within every child is the seeds of possibly a warrior in the future, somebody who's prepared to lie down their life for their country or whatever, pro patria mori, etc. Fascinates me, that combination of innocence and latent aggression that is needed to be a fighter. Interested me, and that's what I wanted to try and get to in these boy images is something that's ambiguous, really.
And again, it sort of relates directly back to that painting, doesn't it? That Father Christ painting, pretty much.
In the
It does,
yeah.
because it is a kind of duality in a way, you know, if you think about it.
Absolutely, yes, yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely.
And I know that in this particular series, you've a sculpture called The Soldier of Marathon Announcing Victory. You've used this as well in your Soldier series?
Yeah, well, it's a real ironic. I titled the work Victory because it seems to me a great example of the sacrifice that soldiers make. The marathon runner legs it back to Athens, says, "We've won," and then drops down dead.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was an image that I wanted to include.
Just show, so this is the Victory.
I was trying to get him to look as exhausted as possible.
Yeah, he does.
Yes, yeah. On the way out, ghostly sort of fellow, yeah.
He does, well, yeah. And if you could now talk about the early beginnings of your companion piece of show, and I know that we touched on the companion piece of show in the podcast, just preparations for it, but where did the title come from? So where did you get the title companion pieces?
Okay, it may be of interest to everyone, probably only Adrian knows this, but I really deliberated what the hell am I going to call this show, what the hell am I going to call it, and I created, I must be going mad I think for a little while, long term, I created a spreadsheet and I actually created a little formula to concatenate strings of variable phrases and things that, it's a bit like illustrious corpses, if you know the Serena's game, try and start some great title for this show that was going to garner attention. And I failed, I didn't get there. What I ended up with companion pieces ultimately worked, where I had some quite interesting titles that may go on to become works in the future. There wasn't anything I thought, it's just not working. Companion pieces the only thing it did, because what it did in my mind was afford me the opportunity of stopping doing what I was doing in other shows, which is, especially with Soldier, which is heading quite down a narrative route towards a quite well-defined theme that gave me lots of opportunity to delve into symbolism, surrealism, you know, all aspects of the figure art and suggest content. But what the title didn't do was allude to the way I was making the work. And already in Soldier, to an extent in To&Fro, I've started to introduce mixed media elements into the work, and the process was becoming more and more important. And by naming this show right up front, Companion Pieces, it set me on a path to making this show about experimenting with materials and pushing the content back in favour of talking about companion pieces, dualism, unity of opposites, dialogue processes by which I make the work. That was a shift that stretched me in a way I really felt I wanted to become more about how the artwork is being made and why the materials are functioning in a particular way, to what end they're serving, as well as me making the image and making a quasi-person, you know, making this idea of something that has a mysterious character that is appealing to somebody from a reading. They'll come to it and they'll read it and say, oh, I wonder if that's an old man or a young man. You know, they're projecting something outside of the picture. For companion pieces, I wanted to allow that to happen, but I wanted to bring in this other aspect, which is when somebody comes in, a viewer looks at it, they're going to be saying, okay, well, what's he doing here in sculpture that maybe relates to the drawings that are behind it? Or why has he gone down the ceramic route as opposed to working on paper?
And if you could talk a bit about your Fixer series, so it's this one on the blackboard, and forgive me if I get the wrong names, but these two right here as well.
Those two, Unique and Allure, 1 and 2.
But they're kind of related, aren't they, to
They're all the fixed.
Same motif.
Basically, the blue fixture on the end wall is, for want of a better explanation, I call him the Big Daddy, because he's originally the print matrix that produced a series of carborundum prints, none of which are actually, they're hidden here, because all the fixer series take that motif that are here, behind me to the left, and to the right, and up there.
As well.
Yeah. That motif of a strange multi-legged figure all come from that plate. We went through a printing press with carborundum grit on there, shaped off. That's now become painting. But all the prints that weren't actually successful to my eye, I kept back in the plan chest and then applied layers of wash to, and each one, so Unique, Allure 1 and 2, they were laying over each other like that. And then I would cut through with a scalpel and swap over the elements. So here, and there, and here, straight cut down the middle.
We would cut through some components and we cut through the previous layers as well.
Each one is cut through together and then reassembled, so you get a pretty clean joint. So this one up here is the tightest one, the one that's higher than the others. You can hardly see that as the collage, but it is.
And in terms of how you start work, so you can take pictures as an example, do you just draw from your imagination and maybe reference things that you've seen in books or certain artifacts? So how did you start? Fixer?
They've grown out of other figures. So there were all sorts of attempts in sketchbooks over the years to make figures in different ways. And one thing I struggled with maybe 10 or 20 years ago was the superfluous elements of the figure that don't really add anything to what I'm trying to say. And I've always felt quite strongly that you have to take liberties as a painter. In fact, you can take liberties. It's only a painting, so you can actually do whatever you want with anatomy, unless your interest lies in capturing something retinally. You can go anywhere with things, but not everything works. And they've grown out of that. They've grown out of an attempt to, you can see it, not with somebody like Lucy Floyd, very much he's looking intensely at something, capturing through the mark making, building that form, and all the veins and sunny flesh. In contrast, somebody like Bacon, he's closer to maybe what I was trying to do. He always banged on about, not wanting to be illustration, trying to avoid being boring and making paint talk about illustrating. But he still had problems, when it came to somebody's Mac or something, he was trying to make it interesting. You could see he wasn't as interested in that as in the face or whatever. That's why I think his portraits are possibly the best element of his genre. But quite often with Bacon's clothing, he does nail it. He gets a pinstripe suit, he makes them very interesting out of it, there's a comedy to it. But for me personally, I was very unsatisfied with the way I was making figures. This was after art school and so on. There's nothing interested me about the particular specifics of a figure, trying to express the whole thing. And I suddenly thought, homunculi. These little things you get in Natural History Museum, whatever, where they're funny little figures that are proportional to the amount of sensory, how many senses there are. So they look like Mick Jagger or whatever. You've got big lips, you've got great big hands, very thin arms.
Right, okay. I don't think I've seen these.
They're proportional, they're very funny. And I thought, well, I'm not going to copy an homunculus, but why not? Why not do an emotional homunculus that the figure is modified to the extent that you're interested in it. And that kind of set me on this my own personal figurative journey where if I want legs to look like crazy sausages or not have legs at all, then I'm going to... I don't want to suggest that's whimsical, but it's kind of like trying to do away with things that's superfluous to a painting.
And what interested you in those particular kind of swollen figures? Was it the fact that you could do so much with them, that you could multiply them so many times and get so much out of them? What was it that really interested you about them?
I don't think I can answer that. Because it would suggest that I've kind of evolved in aesthetic.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm saying that. I'm maybe what I'm saying I see some limits of my practice. So I'm inclined to go after a particular way of making an image because it feels more successful. It's subjective, I don't know. But that's how I end up doing it. I think it's easier to see over time. I can only really talk about it now. Sometimes you have to take a leap in the dark with these things, and with a new form, you have to kind of follow it through. You're not really sure what you've got for a while.
Yeah, I think that's what you've kind of done with these figures, and we'll talk about those, I think, in part 2.
Yeah.
But I think, with the sculpture, especially in ceramics, you're kind of taking it a leap in the dark, really, because it was a new techniques for you, wasn't it?
It's about, I do think a lot. I do work quite instinctively. Sometimes, you get a surprise and that's good. But you try and get in that space where you can just work. When you're painting, certain things happen. When you're working with clay, and I'm not particularly experienced with working with clay, but you can kind of get a result quite quickly in 3 dimensions and see something. It's very satisfying. You find that you actually take some of my 2-dimensional motifs and put them into a 3-dimensional board. I don't think I'm going down the route of studying. I can become a sculptor first and then second. These are all little sources into the third dimension to actually see what my motifs look like when I translate them into something that has to stand on the base. So I think where I go with this next is back into the painting.
I think so.
Yeah.
Into painting.
Absolutely.
Do you think that you'll be using different techniques, similar techniques, or how?
I think one thing that has typified my work over the last decade or so is that I quite often work an image, scrape back and remove stuff and then reassemble it, or maybe destroy it completely and then turn it the other way up, and maybe there's something remaining there that becomes then the final image. It's an attempt to try and get away from that. Some of the people I've been looking at, I've really admired. It's where you say something once, but you say it right, And I'd like to incorporate a little bit more of that into my work, so that I nail something. Measure twice, cut once.
What I really like in the show is the silver point works. Is that much more particular, much more precise than what works. Do you think that you work in a similar way to perhaps your painting that you'd like to do?
They're a little bit I hesitate to say indulgence because that suggests that I'm kind of, it doesn't invalidate me, but it's the wrong word to use. But they're a release, they're a relief from doing painting, because with silver point you have to be incredibly methodical and you can't get the dark through pressure, you just have to constantly hatch. And they're quite therapeutic, I suppose, in a way to do that, but you have to visualise up front what it is you want to do.
Yeah, I was going to say, how did you know? Because
you draw ever so lightly with the silver point. You lay a bone ash ground. It's a lovely thing to do actually, and then it's got a slight tooth to it. And with the silver point, you then very lightly drag over. You can lay out a form, and then because the line is so fine, you've got a chance to modify slightly. So that's how those emerge. But so I think I'll keep those going. I think you'll see it excellent as well. It'd be nice to do something a lot larger, but
how big do you think that you can go with that?
well, I've seen some quite large silver points, but I don't know what effect I'd get with that.
How take you? Because they do look kind of quite
well, it's difficult. So I tend to work for 3-4 hours at a time. I'd say maybe 25-30 hours per drawing, maybe. Yeah.
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 And they look really intense compared to some of the other works as well.
You get quite a lot of detail.
Yeah.
You know, the ink drawing next to it really depends. That was built up over two laying downs, I think. You know, there's a grey wash there, and then the brush thing. So maybe the whole thing was maybe, could add up to about 8 minutes.
I was reading your press release, and you said that you do think that all successful art combines essential dualities. How do you think that art is successful in that way? What do you mean by
that quote, that line comes from, there was a tutor at Coventry on my foundation, John Mead, as some people know him, the painter. And to my young ears, he introduced a book, he introduced me to an American philosopher, Siegel, who had this idea of the unity of opposites, and I forgot the name of the book, but it was written by people who had been through this particular, it wasn't a cult, but he really did set up a movement that a lot of people assigned to. There's this whole idea that the theory of opposites was every great art had two opposing forces that were reconciled to make the art came back to a reconciliation of those two opposing forces. That stuck with me. He used to bang on about Braque. You look at Braque, you see it in Braque, whatever. That kind of got in the back of my head for a long time, and I just came back to it for the show, really. I've never read the book. I kind of picked up, I read around it, and Siegel seems to be, there's still a foundation, I think, going that you can assign to. So that doesn't interest me the slightest, but that idea.
Yeah.
So, at a very basic level, if you look at painting, you can appraise it from the point of view of tone, and light, dark, shadow, or something like that, something emerging out of that, chiaroscuro or whatever. You can look at colour harmonies or dissonance of even the moderns. You can look at positive and negative space and head worth and things like that. There's lots of different ways. Poussin's a great one, Cézanne, who take a surface and just animate the whole picture plane so your eye is never bored wherever you're going. There is, even if it's a space, there is something happening there. It may be a lovely blue behind a yellow of a drapery in front of it. They're all kind of...
I mean, it's a decent stance. Beautiful works, just a couple of hours, in so many different ways. And even if you think about painting, some painting look like sculptures and some sculptures look like paintings. So again, it's that unifying of the opposites, which is what you're trying to do in the show. So yes. Okay, do you want to take a break now?
I think so, yeah. So I think we'll have a little 5 to 10 minute break and then resume.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
There we go. Right, we're live.
Welcome back, everybody. So I think we should now talk more about your companion pieces show. You were saying earlier that you want to move away from the narrative, and you want to focus more on the idea of pictorial concern. So if you could maybe talk a bit more about why you want to do that and how the show has maybe, achieved that aim.
It's multifold, really. It's not that I've got a downer on narrative, but the way that where do I think I've got the most mileage going forward? Where do I think I need to develop? It's not in the narrative or the symbolic or content direction. That is going to look after itself, I believe. I think I need to invest time looking at the way I use my materials, how I approach and column my content into form that makes sense and makes an enjoyable work of art. I want these things to function either as sculptures or paintings or whatever. I want the pictorial concerns to function well. I don't know if function is the right word, but I want somebody to have, or to get from my art, something that gives them something for many years to come. If it's purely about the content, for me that isn't something that in the art that I have around me, it doesn't really tick off particular boxes for me. I want something when I look at it that I'm getting the medium as well.
When you say pictorial concern, what do you actually mean? Because I know that when I came here last Saturday, and we were talking about this piece here, which is called Deptford Director, and he was saying, you know, his arms are outstretched and he's welcoming the visitor, but he's got the face, but you can see faces within the body. Is that what you mean by pictorial concern? So it's you're recognising things within sculptures or things within.
When I mentioned pictorial concern just back then, I was thinking just purely about my 2D work. But here, the figural thing going on with the suggestion of the head, which I'm pleased you picked up on, that's here. This, by the way, it's a face on both sides. You get whichever way you look at it, you've got a head. But there's also a head here. Actually, is a little nod to medieval art. European medieval art, where you get all these sort of strange figures with faces and body. There is, for me, a successful conjunction of form and content together. That kind of emerged through a making of it. The same willful libertarian approach to the figure is the fact that he's got 3 legs, not 2. That is also driven by the fact that it's a 3-dimensional piece of work and it needed to be stable. So the armature actually grew out of that as well. And I decided to make something of that rather than try and hide it by suggesting a figure leaning against columns.
And to go back to your 2-dimensional work, so we can talk about the idea of the pictorial concern. When I came here last week, I recognised a motif that we could just flip to the back. So we've got these 2 pieces here, dot 1 and dot 2. And the top section of that, so this bit here, is almost exactly the same motif in the
painting Woodman.
In the painting Woodman, which you was completely by accident, or you hadn't. No. I was very. Just to clarify, I was very excited that you picked up on it. I was over the moon because effectively these started out, I can probably put, there's photographs online, but these are a press mould from a painting that, let's backtrack a bit. The diptych there, and diptych here were all panels from one painting from about 2009 that have been reworked, reassembled. So there's a fragmentary aspect to them. And I've made new paintings out of combining those panels. The strange white shape in the right-hand panel of Woodman, Lucy picked up, actually slots onto a painting that isn't here, that created the press mould for the ceramics. So that, if you take the green painting there with the white shape, that would fit it on top of the ceramic here. If anybody looking at it thinks, well, it doesn't look like it's going to line up, that's because the clay, when it's fired, shrinks. So there's about 10-20% shrinkage there. But that's where this motif came from. And then the title Doc came much later by me. When I made these, I made 4 or 5, I think. But I'm exhibiting 2 conjoined. And the title came quite late. But it's the idea. I'm very conscious that we're in Deptford, and the idea of the Doc
else, as we've spoken about elsewhere, in my work, there is a male-female yin-yang couple sexual thing as well, and Doc alludes to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain duality I think going on between these two, like you say, light and dark, and also, I know in the podcast that we spoke about Cain and Abel, the biblical story, between good and evil, and maybe that represents that as well.
Well, certainly, yes, I'm very happy with that reading, if people pick up on that, but also another theme that fascinated me for a long while was the sort of two alpha males of Coriolanus and Orpheus.
Yeah.
So there's kind of that rivalry set up across the room that things are buried. You know, I want somebody to come in here and just enjoy the work, but I don't mind sharing all the things that maybe drove me to make the work. But I don't think the prerequisites, I hope anyway, that people getting something out of it. I want them to go with their own readings.
And if you could talk a bit more about one of the things you show, which is the sibling rivalry.
Okay.
Idea. So if you could talk a bit more about that. Because we did touch on it last week, right?
Yeah.
So
That was one of the things I wanted to try, and obviously Cain and Abel thing we're talking about there, the rest of it, but that was built into the brief for the show, into the press release and everything, as something that I thought I could work towards and articulate. And I've ended up articulating it in a way that I didn't expect. I had other works which aren't in the show that maybe would have done it from a content point of view. The sibling rivalry that exists in this room is really from that blue fixer and all the prints that it generated. Yeah? And what I mean by sibling rivalry is that each of these companion pieces, the pairs of works that are there, are calling for your attention as a viewer. They are in close proximity to each other, and they are saying, look at me. That's where I think the sibling rivalry, it's a metaphor, exists in this show.
I mean, we're saying that this corner here, is quite active when it comes to that theme, and how they're all kind of, this corner particularly, that they're all trying to fight for the viewer's attention. Yeah.
Well, through the work, that's why I wanted to try and put the Deptford director over here. In his rather flattened pause, there is a suggestion of a ball or whatever, possibly, which is echoed in the drawings. And I think that he basically grew out of this. The ink drawing is another three-legged figure, so that's, there's a reference there across maybe a year, across 12 months to that. The scurrying thing, I call it, which is the ink drawing down at the bottom here, is actually driven by personal anxieties around how stuff can happen to you. So that was a personification of particular worries that have got nothing to do with art, about life or age or health or whatever. Has something to come running in, it's like a horror movie, with a lot of legs running up and down at once, So that's where that scurrying thing came from.
Yeah.
But other works are different in tone, they're not about that. So, the Fixer series is, the illusion in Fixer is about that. When I said about sibling rivalry, saying over here, it's that holding the audience, holding the viewer to the artwork. That successful artwork should fix something, or transfix something. It's also an allusion back to To&Fro about the idea of the merchants and traders and these people, these agents who are brokers for need, whether it's tea or whether it's opium, whether it's silver or whatever. The merchant class is something that exists everywhere, and as we've seen with Banksy this week, the art market has its own merchants as well. So Fixer is a bit of a placeholder for everything.
know it's not in fashions, but I'm really intrigued by the one above, this one above the door.
That's what I called that changeling because the black figure. I find that every so often you've got to understand when I'm whittling on about all the things that interest me. One of the things I'll talk about, if it isn't about alpha males and correlators and whatever it is rites of passage and childhood. So this one I call changeling because what evolved out of the painting, going through quite a few iterations, was a nod back to the blueberries, but also this later figure that's dark and sinister and so on, which is elsewhere developed as a child. Here it seems a little bit more ominous. Yeah, a little bit more ominous. And it was that sort of dual nature of the being, I don't want to say child, of the being. It's like a duende, you know, in Spanish culture, or a daemon, you know, in other cultures. Not demon.
Do you think that there's a relationship between changelings and this?
Well, there is.
Like Pepper is here with, you know, two on the side.
He came about in the same way as this one.
Yeah.
He is another recycled print matrix. A carborundum print generated a lot of prints with that dark figure motif. And that's been worked out then as a painting, which the earliest dates I was rather sad to say goodbye to, but I couldn't push it on and I've got to something else. And I wish I could have kept both. But I wanted there to bring up the background and the rhythms of the yellow and the jade green as something that kept the eye dancing around a little bit.
I think, you know, it's really, I don't know if it's just me, but the fact that you've placed it there and the shadow of the head, you know, the black almost looks like a halo. It almost looks slightly religious in a way, almost like from a Renaissance image.
I really don't mind that reference because for a long while I looked at, especially, I was going to Spain a lot, I was going to places like the Romanesque and Medieval Art Museum in Barcelona, where there are incredibly sort of paintings lifted from chapels around the Pyrenees, but also amazing wood carvings. I was also a Church of England, but I'm not religious now, sort of atheist or humanist, or whatever it's called. But those forms of devotional art I'm fascinated by, extremely grateful for, get an awful lot from looking at still. And I think that comes out in the work. I think some of the very simplified ways I'm working with the figure do reference not just Romanesque art, but sometimes going back to other cultures, not Christian culture, but maybe going back to the classical world, sort of pre-Hellenic, sort of Cycladic, and also Asian art as well.
And in terms of your charter idea, I was thinking about sculptures and also the silver point and how it's kind of a hard and soft, three-dimensional, two-dimensional duality going on. So the texture of these are quite soft, and you've got these which are kind of hard and clay-like.
Well, the interesting thing about clay, it's a very sensual material to work with. You know, you get messy, and it's sloppy, and move through your hands, and you can create and destroy quite quickly. It's a lovely thing to work with. But after you fire it, it's hard, it's really sharp and impersonal to an extent that you know, these dot works, especially this one, this side, the surface is very different. It's glazed and it's more impersonal. It's kind of very, very nice. It's quite an attractive surface as well. It's very different to the intimacy of oil paint on canvas, where you can see the. I've talked elsewhere about Isabel Graff, she's a recent discovery in art writer. she talks about the ghostly presence of the absent author, and I think that's a wonderful phrase when you're looking at a work of art.
And how have you incorporated that quote into your, or do you think you have? Do you think that you've incorporated it into your work?
I'd like to think that it's visible. I don't think I've intentionally incorporated it. I think it's a phrase I came across through reading just this year, but it's a phrase I would want somebody to use when they look at my work, is that they sense the presence of the person who made it, rather than it being something that is very impersonal. Sometimes art can seem quite remote from the author who made it. Maybe untypically, I still feel quite bound to that mode of production. A lot of contemporary art sometimes tries to take the individual out of the object, and make a statement, whether it's conceptual, whether it's about painting beyond the canvas or indexality or whatever. The artist is almost the idea of the artist from a romantic point of view is evaporated. Well, I'm kind of by my fingernails holding on to the hope that possibly art can still embrace the idea of authorship and the individual art.
I think that's very important today. I think we're living in a society now of post-truth and division, and there's just so much bitterness, and I think that you're right. We need to retain the individual in our lives. It's really important. You look at the privacy thing, we know it's privacy. Once it slipped through and it was shredded, it's just, I don't know.
Increased by 50%.
And then what does it even mean?
My view on that is, it's a clever stunt. He's got his cake and he's eating it because he's seen as some kind of guerrilla artist, a street artist who is very critical of the system, but he's operating within it. I think it's very unlikely that Sotheby's didn't know. They weren't in on it. It's my opinion.
And how do you see your practice going forward from companion pieces? What kind of new developments have you spoken about painting? What kind of direction could you see your paintings going in, or maybe other directions?
I'd like to slow down. When this show comes down, I've got a few other things. I'm back here for the painting opening in December. But other than that, I just want to stop getting myself out there. It's been a very busy year, and get back to the studio until maybe next summer. Obviously, I'll keep my eye out for things that come up. But I think I've got a lot of things in this show that need further examination. So I want to pack this work up carefully and basically just reflect on it and see what happens if I produce more work in the same vein. So I want to slow it all down and just consolidate what has happened this year. Reflect not just on this show, but Soldier and some of the things that I've said through this talk and so on. Actually, can't question it and just say, that is definitely something that I should be examining more. And other things, maybe say, next time I'll do an outing, I won't do this, I won't do that. I'll maybe just concentrate on those areas. What those areas are, I'm not really sure yet, but I think it involves the idea of making a contrast, whether it's a diptych or whether it's actually pushing through the work and then introducing it in a way that makes sure it surprises me. That's where I think it's going. But I want to take it back to mark making. I want to think about what drawing means to me. And go back to the two-dimensional surface.
I think you've kind of explored that in the show already with the silver point and with the print face work. So you're touching on that already.
I mentioned earlier about, one thing I want to try and do, which is make the mark once and nail it. There's a painter I saw, she shows at Cape Gary, you'll see her at Frieze, called Patricia Tribe, T-R-E-I-B. She's very sort of school of Paris. She works about this bit in watercolour or whatever until she's got a composition that she wants to paint, and then she just does it on one go. And they are, I think they are some of the nicest colour, but nice in its true sense of being fine. They are fine painters. They really are. They've really got legs.
And in some ways, perhaps skill, because to make one mark and for it to say something and do something is it's really difficult to do.
Well, they rely on the edge, the proximity to the edge of the canvas, these shapes, and if she makes one mistake, I think she's bugging up. Excuse my French, but I don't know how often that happens, what the attrition rate is, but she works out very carefully. The little watercolours themselves are beautiful. They're very good, and I don't know whether you saw the was it Pace recently? These strange sort of erotic shapes. She was very interesting as well. Louis. I'll have to look it up. I'll put on the notes to this.
But I think that you were kind of touching on that idea with the silver print, because you were saying earlier you have to work really, really carefully. So the mark that you make, you can't be kind of messy or you can't be like what you can do with these prints. You have to be very fine and to think about what you're going to be doing.
But Hockney talks about that. He talks about watching a Chinese brushman at work who loaded the brush up, looks at his paper, pauses, and then just creates a snail with the brush in one brush stroke. And then as he drags the brush out, there's enough ink in that to have created a snail. The residual ink creates a sliver of a snail. And Hockney said this was the epitome for him of, the painter's craft, that you command the material. Of course, Velázquez was it. All the great painters do it. They nail it.
And is that what you want to do?
I don't want to paint snails.
No, not to paint snails. But did you want to get to that point?
One wants command, one's medium, whether it be word or the keyboard or whatever. But yes, I'm just saying that there are two different modes over there. There's the speed. It's all about speed. You get one image if you move it. With ink, you move at a certain speed. You get that line. You can't make that line too slowly or too fast. But with the silver point, you're working in this very laborious sort of way, and that is quite attractive if you just want to feel that you've had a day's work for an image.
And again, there's a kind of a duality going on there, isn't there, with these two different ways of working.
There's loads of, you can slice and dice this show in many.
The more time you spend in the exhibition, the more duality to certain things that you can actually start seeing.
Absolutely. Which is what we want, out of this show, is for people to do that. Basically, go away with that person So, should we go to I think so, let's do that, So, has anybody got any questions? Anything you'd like to, any observations or anything?
We haven't talked much about colour. I mean, I'm sitting just here and I'm looking at those two above your head. Sort of, I don't know what you call it, puce or mauve or something. And this is slightly almost electric and blue colour. I mean, it's a fairly unusual colour kind of choice, as it were. It's quite different from agree with colour. Do you think colour, I mean, I think it plays a big part in your work, or is the...
Yes. I mean, the blue over there, I mixed up. I keep these they're not Tupperware, you know the sort of Tupperware things, resealant lids for food and so on. And I mixed up, that's an acrylic wash. I mixed that up from a cerulean and a raw umber, but it's a nod. There's a little bit of green in there as well. I'm trying to hit the blue, I call it Delacroix blue, but it's a particular blue that, I mean, Delacroix is a little more turquoise than that, but this paint got modified over time. I've used it a lot over a couple of years, but I found it very useful to have all these pre-mixed colours that I knew meant something to me in a different capacity. And it's just a colour that's got a lot of significance for me for all sorts of personal reasons. This blue is more an experimental one where I looked before the cut. I just mixed up the colour, and it's an emotive thing. It's not an intellectual thing. I use colour. I struck a colour that I felt might work. So.
And likewise with the stock one and one two.
Well, this is a bit of a gaming nod towards Luca della Robbia, the Renaissance, the two brothers, della Robbia brothers, who, when I first saw these, when I first went to Italy, these ceramic works like that, it's kind of sophisticated ceramics. This is not sophisticated in the same way. I didn't like them. And so this is a nod to my journey. I actually love them. You know, if I had the money, I'd have a della Robbia ceramic in my art collection, because I think they're incredible things. And that the colour there is a nod to try and strike that white and blue that they use.
It's really good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And what about Dot 2?
That was trying to get something almost African out, you know, it's like trying to get something woven, or, you know, the textures you get on African sort of vases and going back in time. The surface wasn't working for me to clay until I drew into it like that. So, yeah, and it was going back a little bit to the silver point, drawing the lines into the clay was very satisfying. As you have to be careful. I mean, it's not very precise, but you know, that was all hand done, and not to disturb the other fresh loafing type bits of the proceedings.
Can I ask about this kind of central figure? Obviously, it gets repeated, varied in all kinds of ways. I think it's a really fascinating figure. This sense of something very contemplative, but also this potential to scurry or scuttle.
Yes.
It's very, very interesting. The tension between movement and status. So I think that's something which I pick up from. The question is, what are these? I mean, I've seen them before in your work, but these kind of strange, wonderful ears, if that's what they are.
They in the To&Fro show, they evolved into that as if you go back to, I think it was either Song or Qing dynasty, but the Chinese court officials had these hats with these very strange things that come out sideways. Do you know why?
Right.
To stop them from whispering to each other. So they couldn't, yeah. It's absolutely incredible. I didn't realise that. Stop them in court, whispering and conspiring. They couldn't conspire to their own stupidity. When it came to me determining the figures for To&Fro, it evolved out of that. But they're not exactly, because there the hats come out in a different way. Here, they function to me as like large ears, but also extra figures. So it's like a mother, it came out of the Blue Boy series. These, either side of the Blue Boy were the mother and father of that quasi-person, which the only existing painting. It's not a portrait of anybody, me or anybody else in real sense. It's a function of the painting. But those Blue Boy series were, as you know, quite strange pictures. A bit playful, a bit absurd, and playing with all sorts of sexual imagery and illusion and so on, with the idea of the child actually being something innocent as well, and that sort of awakening consciousness of the central figure, almost like a Christ child as well, which for me is playing with a sort of compromised system. And I find that quite interesting, that whole idea of working with things that I think have still got quite a lot of emotion, they pack an emotional punch. But the systems that underpin those for many years and had a single reading, you know, if you went to the Shard Cathedral or you moved around Europe for many centuries, there was one assigned reading to all of these things. Well, I think the narratives have opened up, the stories have opened up, the readings of those works, for good or worse, have opened up too. So, when people look at paintings now, I don't think they don't mind reading other stuff into it, because they're not taught the same way about what those particular narratives were. So quite a lot of people go around the National Gallery and look at the painting, and they don't have any ideas. They enjoy it on its own terms. Is that wrong? Or maybe they're missing out, but also why not? You know, why not in these times? Why not?
Especially with the historical works, for example, like in the National Gallery, you know, the ones that are hundreds of years old, I think it's still going to actually look at them and see things within them that they're not made.
Yes, yeah. Well, that goes back to what I say, what I'm trying to do, what I hope to try and do is to shift the focus towards making the art, because I think that's why people come back. It's not because of the content.
Yeah.
It's because of how that content is delivered, how it's realised, materials used that matter. You know, there's some history you can't put down, it's not science.
Yeah, exactly. Any more questions?
I was just considering, I mean, you were talking about religious art before, and you mentioned the icon, the way that.
Yeah.
And, I mean, because those two figures aren't there, those are duality, but basically you tend to have an approach of having a single figure in the middle who's then seen very directly. So there's that kind of iconic quality rather than, I know that in your soldiers, I mean, you did have the two figures, and they were key, one from the eye, which is, well, from the single figure, shall I say, but you tend to prefer this very, single figure bang.
The idea of frontality, the idea of this figure just presented, saying, right, here I am.
Yes.
You're the audience. I'm the artwork.
Exactly. It doesn't mean what's your
So it is that idea of and this goes for abstract painting too, but that idea of frontality, the idea of the artwork is there, saying, affecting you, is something I think is very interesting. I'm doing it from the point of view of the figurative painting, but I think abstract art can do that as well, equally well.
I mean, it is, I don't know that we do mention African art, because but often African art, or sculptures, they're just one figure, which is an icon.
Yes. I mean, that's the art that, if I was pushed, to say what gets me again and again, it's, for example, Michelangelo's slaves, or a psychedelic figure like this, or, something in maybe a bomber and outback. It's a human figure facing me out of the artwork, and accusing. There's something in there that says to me, figures.
Also the monkeys.
And the
mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And that's a particular interest, because what it is, the reason why you're surprised by it is because you have a body image. We've all got one, we're doing it right now, but when we look at our monkeys, that is the truth.
Yes.
the innovation of our skins.
Yes.
And so it's quite a shock. You get re-embodied,
Yes.
or more authentically embodied, and that can trigger. I've seen children in front of that actually look where their legs are. They actually suddenly get a shock because they're so optically obsessed, and they suddenly become embodied again. And for somebody like yourself, looking around here, you might almost say they're homuncular in many ways, that the body, you re-embodied yourself, you can't get that out of it. Once you've seen an homunculus, you never forget it.
Yes.
And the thing is, that brings the tactile, the senses, other than vision, back into your painterly process, I think.
Yeah. Well,
There's an awful lot of tactility in this, and then we go from painting into sculpture. I don't think it's an accident.
I think it's fair to say I'm a essentialist. I'm not an intellectual, sort of dry, academic sort of painter. I think that the homunculus is a map. It's a presentation of the figure in a particular. It's a model, and it's a model of the senses. But yes, it serves as it's created for a scientific purpose. But that seeing her homunculus is fun, but it also, to me, inspiring, as you said, you get re-embodied.
Well, also, people tend to look at the homunculus, but not what's around.
Yes.
We're embodied in space.
Yeah.
So actually, that's one of the unifying opposites that's in the work, because we have literally a refigured space as well as a refigured figure. That's very, very important. Once you re-embody yourself,
Yes.
and you paint and sculpt in that way, it becomes very different from what the narrative does fall away. Another interesting consequence of it, isn't it? And if you look at these works, I was watching, they're very tactile works. And this means that if you think about body and self, body and other, as being the duality of opposites that would guide the whole thing, then you can go from others, other than that, the world itself, that which is within the world itself, and it gets very exciting.
That's great feedback. There's one thing I really must add as well, which I haven't mentioned before in this context, but I guess based on what you've just said, the penny has dropped. For the last couple of years, I've been floating, these sensory deprivation tanks. Yeah, I've been doing that monthly, and there you are stripped from the outside world entirely, and you're stripped. You're not stripped by anybody else. You take off all your clothes, you get in the tank, and the water is incredibly buoyant. It's and you're, I don't know whether anybody's done it, but it's maybe not for everyone, but I love it. And I think that has fed into the work, because I literally just,
You're located in your body then, because there's no external sources coming in to say that's another. So you're thrown back on your embodied self.
Yes.
The self has to have, it finds its own body in an anechoic chamber. That's the work.
What's inside the body and outside the body when you're doing it.
Yes, you become a lot more, because when you first float, you become conscious of the what I call radio noise. When you first get in, you realise just how cranky your body is. You're really tense, especially across the shoulders. And then as you relax, then what is there is the radio noise of your thoughts.
Yes.
And all sort of, and then you chill out.
Yes.
So it's a bit hippie, but it is very good. It is very, very good. Yeah. Highly recommended. I should have bought a t-shirt, so it's floatingpoint.co.uk, Pangborn, hopefully get discounts.
Good. So are these, I haven't looked at the programme, I haven't looked at the works very closely exactly yet, but so these, are these based on prints? You said that this was originally...
That was the proper term is print matrix, that it was mountain card, where I drew the image on, and then I put down glue and then sprinkled carborundum grit onto this, and built up a surface that is equivalent to an etched plate, and then sealed that with French polish, and then that can be inked up and put through a press to create a carbon print. Yeah, it's very nice. It gives a very nice black. Yeah, and that's what the mottled effects are on the paper. So when I said that was a daddy of it, it is because that all the prints were generated from that before it got turned into a painting. So all the like unique little 1 and 2 over there and here, they're all started out as prints on paper that came out of the press.
But from that same...
From that
original.
yeah. So, you know, if you examine each of these, you'll see the same mark again and again, but because of the way the plate was inked up, because of the way that I subsequently applied wash or acrylic or collage or other elements over the top, they look different at first. They look different, they're actually quite similar. And that goes back to the, we're never more alike when we're trying to be individual. You know, I was kind of playing with that. There was a bit of a hook to try and get people's attention to the shows that were held on there. But it was a serious comment. I think quite often when we as human beings are, when we feel an urge to try and be unique and try and be something, get out and get noticed, that really makes us just like the other Joe who's trying to do that, like, you know, in a very crowded marketplace. So by highlighting that, what I'm trying to say is the opposite path, which is just investigating very quietly, just on your own terms, what interests you and seeing that comes out. And then just building on that slowly. It's a long game. Yes, very long game.
Any more questions?
I'm just reverting to the colours that I chose. So black obviously plays an enormous part, at least in these works, and really almost on top of, you know, beyond almost the colour thing. I think about that, was it Matisse? Was it? No, it was Renoir. I was at Matisse, you're not an artist until you discovered how to put black on things. How to put black on a painting without making a hole in the surface. That was the comment. But so whenever I see all the black in a painting, I think about that. You know, since I don't paint, I don't really know about those issues. But it's a fairly sinister. I mean, what I'm saying is your view of your concern with the sinister is the right word, but the tense underlying aspects of humanity and psychology, which the black seems to.
Well, I think for a long while, I mean, I had more than one person tell me never use black and whatever, and I actually disagree with this. You look at Manet, you look at Goya, you know, they used pure black, they weren't optical blacks, they were working. It is possible to use black very effectively in Matisse as well. But it can fall back, it can kill a painting, you know, if you don't use it. There's good about blacks, but in terms of what the blacks mean here, I would agree with you, it has got sinister undertones. I've tended to always, rather than say sinister, I've talked about sol y sombra, because I was a bit of a Spanish madman for a while. And I found that was the best way of talking about how I felt my work was the duality again, you know, sun and shade. Because life is like that, and I think that's why I like artists like Goya and Picasso. They are a bit difficult sometimes and uncomfortable, but they embrace both sides of the equation. And
Because of the stage you get, I mean, where you have very strong sun, you also get very strong shadows, so you get blacks.
I mean, the Spanish art again and again, Murillo does it. The child appears in Murillo, and they're quite often gypsies with dark feet. You know, there's something going on there. There's a dark, you've got Valdez Leal, very dark, maggot-ridden priests and stuff. But within Spanish culture, the child is central to that, as in many Mediterranean cultures.
Child.
The child.
The child.
The child, yeah. There's the Spanish worship of child, El Niño. But at the same time, the Spanish culture just has this obsession with death, mortality. The fact that we are all about to exit the stage one day is a very uncomfortable thing. That's what I reconcile myself to. But, I know it's going to happen, but I'm not very happy with that.
I haven't seen the Rivera show, but it's just open.
Yes,
yeah. And I'll look forward to seeing that.
Dulwich, yes.
Yes. Bottle black there.
Yes.
The ship of Theseus.
Oh, the ship of Theseus.
Is that this little black ship poking out behind that?
Yeah, not even say.
Is that black sails, wasn't it? Sails of death.
Yes, there's that element. The ship of Theseus is also the philosopher's paradox about the boat getting rebuilt. And at what point does the ship of Theseus cease to be the original ship of Theseus as it gets the Athenians mend it every year and they bring it down to dock. So that title came after I put that diptych together and put the resin over the top. It's a redaction of the boat symbol that for many years I used. And I just see so many painters now with boats and their work. The resin went on and was quite happy to redact the boat. But my friend Ivan pointed out, he said, I recognise your boat, I can see the prow and I can see the stern just poking out there.
Nearly obliterated, but just not.
Yeah, just enough to poke out there.
You said to me last week that the one on the left, the orange, the tip side of boat resembles the curve in your
Yes, well, defending curves of the unique allure there. I mean, a lot of my work has been sort of there's been phallic images going on. But there I wanted to try and get a feminine curve going on. And I think that I hadn't realised originally, but the white of that shape is like a hip as well. It's got a feminine principle going on in there. Which I quite like, going back to the Theseus story, because formally that kind of is like man on the right, woman on the left.
Yeah.
We all know what Theseus is like. Yeah. Bit of a barrel boy. Yeah. So I think should we call it a wrap?
Yeah.